Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm JC Tops. This week, we're taking a look at wine in the 80s. The 80s was an important decade for wine in the US. It was also an important time for Wine Enthusiast Companies because the magazine was launched during the Revolutionary decade. So in honor of the 35th anniversary of the magazine, not only did the print team create an amazing May issue, which is out now, managing print editor John Capone sat down with Adam Strum to discuss the transformative decade in the US. Adam Strum is the chairman and co-founder of Wine Enthusiast Companies. Wanting to educate the consumer about wine, he, along with his wife, Sybil, launched the magazine in 1988. So listen on as Adam chronicles how he and Sybil founded the magazine, how a large soda company impacted U.S. wine, and the interesting way U.S. wine drinkers learned about different wine varietals.
Hi, this is John Capone, managing editor of Wine Enthusiast Magazine. I'm here today with Adam Strum, founder of Wine Enthusiast. We're talking on the occasion of the publication of the 80s issue and the 35th anniversary of the magazine itself to chat about the decade that wine really blew up, the 1980s. Adam founded the Wine Enthusiast Companies in 1979. The 80s were a transformative time in wine for the U.S., which Adam was not only witness to, but a part of in some ways that might even surprise you. Adam, you've sold wine, created a successful company that brought wine storage and accessories to a rapidly growing market of wine drinkers in the 80s. And then in 1988, you founded Wine Enthusiast Magazine. The company was really a bootstrap startup before we use those words all the time. Can you talk about the earliest days of founding the company in your attic, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we looked around, John, and we identified that there wasn't really a place to find even a corkscrew to pull a cork out of a bottle of wine. And cork at that time was, for many Americans, was an impediment to even wanting to try a bottle of wine. They had no idea how to open it. So the accoutrements, the accessories weren't available. So I was in the wine industry. I was in sales for a very famous distributor in New York, owned by the Taub family, which distributed primarily the wines of Ernest and Giulio Gallo. And it occurred to me that this might be a niche that might have an opportunity now and in the future. And fortunately, it did blow up, and we rode the crest along with the success and growth of wine.
And what was the earliest memories of like being in the attic? I mean, it was real mom and pop before you were mom and pop, you and Sybil.
Well, some of the memories were shipping accessories through our kitchen and huge trailer trucks pulling up our little driveway in our small home in Chappaqua, New York, and the neighbors complaining, what the hell's going on here? You know, what are these trailers? Because we were shipping wine racks to people, and then eventually, when we moved out of our home and took our first place, we were shipping wine refrigerators, wine cellars. We fortunately got an exclusive with the very famous Eurocov French wine cellars, and we started importing them, and thanks to another scribe, who I'm sure you might have bring up, Robert Parker, in the early 80s. Bob Parker deemed the 1982 Bordeaux the vintage of the century. So the little cadre of collectors who purchased Bordeaux in the United States, and it was very small, they went crazy and bought every 1982 first growth, second growth, all classified growth, and they bought them on futures, which meant that they paid for them and they were delivered much later. But when they were delivered, they needed a home. And fortunately, there was the Wine Enthusiast with Eurocovs, wine racks, and other wine refrigerators that they could store. So that was the real beginnings of the company, the blow up. But there were other parts, categories and niches of wine that also were experiencing extraordinary growth.
And at this point, it's what I think is commonly referred to today as a side hustle. Like this was something you were doing while also selling wine for the beginning of the 80s.
Well, I don't usually talk about that. It was a little bit of a side hustle. I mean, I was principally, we needed to bring home the bacon, pay for my family. I had two young children, Erica and Jacqueline, two little girls who are now the presidents of our company. I guess, they keep telling me to watch Succession on TV, and I guess I watched it too much. But the real story was the wine storage took off, and that really helped us grow the business and finance it, and that's where the growth. And then eventually, of course, I resigned from my sales management position, and yet I kept a very warm relationship with the Tal family, who, by the way, my dad also worked for. So it was a third generation, just like they're a phenomenal generational business.
And the Wine Enthusiast Company is really taking off in these early 80s because of, spurred on by the explosion, the revolution in U.S. wine in the 80s.
And that occurred not only at the very high end, but some very interesting things were happening in wine during that period. One of which was, at that time, real wine consumption was purchased with these wines we call generics as opposed to varietals, which were blends of many grapes. And they were sold in 1.5 liter, 3 liter, 4 liter packages. People kept them in their fridge. They had a little wine. People that started to get into wine. And they were generally screw caps, kind of ironic because today a screw cap is, very fashionable. But in those days, it meant a little more inexpensive wine. So generics was the driving force of the business, which was a very small business. And there were like 4 or 5 very prominent ones. Actually, they were referred to as the gamut, which means, and that was an acronym for Gallo, Almaden, Masson, Paul Masson, of course, Inglenook, and Taylor. And Taylor is a very interesting story because this helped blow up the wine business. And actually, we can thank Coca-Cola, of all people, for helping grow the wine business. And here's what happened. Coca-Cola was looking at the wine business, and it seemed to be some growth on a growth track. And they said, we really want to get into this business. So what did they do? They went out and they purchased, which was a pretty prominent brand, the number one selling New York State winery, Taylor New York State wines. And they used that brand to create a California wine to compete with the other parts of GAM, without the T, of course, at that time. Taylor California Cellars was a generic blend. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And they said, well, we're engaged against Pepsi with the Pepsi Challenge. In those days on TV, which was, of course, the driving media force, Coca-Cola and Pepsi were in a war. And were running commercials against each other. Taste test, the taste Pepsi challenge. So they did the Coke challenge. Of course, you can imagine whoever paid for the commercial was the winning cola in terms of taste. So they said, well, let's try this with wine. So they did a taste test with wine. They tasted Taylor California Cellars against Inglenook, Almaden, Paul Masson, and to try and blow it up. But what happened was wine derived a major benefit from this because for the first time, wine was really advertised a lot on TV, and it became incredibly more in the conscience of the American consumer. It's something they should try. Kind of reminds me of a very old story I need to share with everyone about it. Amazing, the real founder of the wine business, one of the main founders, Ernest Gallo. In the 1960s, the Gallo Winery was the first winery to advertise wine on TV. They had this guy riding through the vineyards, Gallo makes wine with loving care, and it was the first time. Suddenly, their major competitor in those days was a company called Italian Swiss Colony. And they came out, they also started to do a little bit of TV. You had this guy, the little old winemaker me, okay? And guess what? So there was a little bit of trade press, and they ran to Ernest. They said, oh, Mr. Gallo, aren't you concerned? Aren't you concerned, Italian Swiss Colony is suddenly advertising against you? And just to show what a big picture and brilliant guy Ernest Gallo was, he turned to him and said, oh, thank God, I'm so thrilled someone else is advertising wine. And that brings us back to the 80s, because here we go. You had majors like Coca-Cola spending millions and millions of dollars promoting their Taylor California Cellars, and that helped revolutionize the wine. Then, guess what? Another very interesting producer of wine came into the picture, and that was the Mariani brothers. They created this brand. The derivative was Lambrusco, which came from Bologna in Italy. They were called Riuniti. And the Mariani brothers were very brilliant at marketing, okay?
I mean, when you started to talk about television, that was one of the things that really jumped out as we were putting together the 80s issue, was how powerful TV was in just all of this, whether it's beer brands or Spuds McKenzie, but Riunite was the big one. We found 1 in every 4 bottles of imported wine sold in the U.S. in 1981 was Riunite, and its TV commercials, the Riunite on Ice, Riunite So Nice, were everywhere. They were ubiquitous. And we had an article written by Jason Wilson of Everyday Drinking about Riunite, but it was almost more about the television commercials than the wines themselves. And in these commercials, they're advertising this kind of a European lifestyle, and the Riunite is always involved. It'll be somebody jumping on a gondola and grabbing a cooler of Riunite, or they're at a ski lodge. But then there's all of us, we're reviewing all these commercials as reference, as we're putting together the feature, and there's this one where it just is bonkers, and they're out in outer space, and there's robots, and they're drinking Riunite, and we showed it to you, and you said, oh, Sybil was on that set. She was involved in producing the
Sybil,
ads.
the name of the company was Hicks and Grice. It was an advertising agency that the Marianis had hired to market Riunite in a big way. And as it turns out, my wife Sybil was a TV producer, and she produced those commercials. And one day, we were on the set, and we saw those robot outfits, because the robots were clinking glass, Riunite on Ice, and they were out in outer space, so just to show how pervasive Riunite was. And I noticed them, and as it turns out, we were about to have our company Halloween party, and we asked the agency, could we borrow these suits? And so Sybil and I turned out to be Riunite robots for a day at the Halloween party. But there's more of a story about Riunite and why it was so important to the growth of wine. Riunite was a primer wine, and there had been primer wines in the past, in the 60s and 70s. And by primer wine, I mean a wine that introduced people to wine. It was easy to drink, and it had a little bit of fruit. I should say really sweet. It had sweetness. Americans, it's very funny, Americans talk dry, but they taste sweet. They really were raised on Coca-Cola, back to Coke again. So, people don't realize that, but, later on, as their palates became a little more sophisticated, they did opt for drier wines. But Riunite had that flavor and sophistication because it was from Italy. It was a nice word to pronounce, and people liked that. Just as in the 60s and 70s, there was Cold Duck and Boone's Farm and things of that nature, which were primer wines.
Called pop wines.
Pop wines. Thank you for the reminder. Yes, they called them pop wines. I mean, Riunite wasn't actually a pop wine. Or also, there was another wine from Spain called Yago Sangria. Sangria was another primer wine, and also sweet, but it was amazing. And they were selling, I think they got up to like as many as 12 million cases. So what happens? People taste this and they say, hey, you know what? This is wine. I like it. I usually used to drink beer. I used to drink Tom Collins, but now I may opt for Riunite. Or what other wines are there? And that brings another story.
Yeah, I mean, how did we get into what they call the fighting varietals as the palate of the Americans becoming more sophisticated?
Great question, John. Yeah. So as I was mentioning, Americans, where wine was these jugs, which were the gamuts, and these gamuts were blends of many grapes, and they were calling them in those days Burgundy. When someone wanted a glass of red wine, they called it Burgundy. And when someone wanted a glass of white wine, they called it Chablis, which, of course, is stealing from a French region. Of course, the Burgundians didn't like this very much, but this...
They took umbrage with that.
They did take umbrage. But thanks to the next part of the story, I think, things changed. But that was a glass. You'd step up to a bar, you ask for a glass of Burgundy, you get a glass of red wine, and it was usually some generic blend. Maybe Inglenook, Almaden, Coca-Cola was hoping it was Taylor California Cellars. That didn't last very long, but that's the story. So let me tell you the story of the fighting varietals and how consumers learned about buying wine with the names of the grapes on the bottles. Well, there was a gentleman named Bruno Benzinger who owned a distributorship in New York called Park Benzinger. And he had a large family, 7 kids. And his oldest son, Michael Benzinger, was a brilliant guy. And he found a winery in Sonoma, in Glen Ellen specifically. And he said, Dad, you got to come out here and see this. It was for sale. And this is something we should really invest in or maybe buy. And guess what? they decided to sell the distributorship, buy the winery, and move out the family from, I believe it was Larchmont. It was Westchester, ironically, not too far from where our current headquarters are in Valhalla. And they moved the family out there, and they started working on Glen Ellen. About this time, I knew the family. I actually was visiting them. And the dad, Bruno, and Michael were sitting around the table, and they said, Adam, why don't you try this? And I decided to, and I tasted the wines, and they were very good. And he said to me, this is Cabernet Sauvignon, this is Chardonnay, this is Merlot. And they had tanks and tanks which were left over from the purchase from the previous owners. And then he said, we're going to bottle this wine, and we're going to put the name of the grape on the wine, and we're going to sell it for $2.99. I said, oh my God. I said, go for it. It's a great idea. And guess what? They did it. And it was tremendously successful. And they decided to continue, and they named these wines, and there were others that came out also to compete with the fighting varietals. These wines got into the conscious of American consumers. Consumers stopped, they didn't stop drinking the generics that rapidly, but they started getting engaged and interested in varietals and the grape names. And there was another very defining group, the Jackson family, Jess Jackson and Barbara Benke, who had a winery in Lake County, which is north of Napa and Sonoma. And they created a very delicious Chardonnay, which had a lot of fruit forward, proprietor's reserve. It became fabulously successful, and consumers were looking for the Kendall Jackson Chardonnay. And what happened? Things changed. Instead of people stepping up to the bar when they wanted a glass of white wine, asking for a glass of Chablis, they started asking for a glass of Chardonnay. And this was the maturity of the American consumer, and varietals, more and more varietals. And although, of course, there were varietals made in the 80s, and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it became more part of the consciousness, front of mind to the American consumer, and they started looking and upgrading their desire for better and better wines.
Yeah, and this was the wine culture and climate of the mid to late 1980s, and you were, right there as all of these things were exploding.
This helped us dramatically with the catalog, of course, because people were drinking. They needed corkscrews now because they had corks in the bottles, and they needed a place to store their wines. But what I identified in 1986, I said, there really wasn't any great at wine education format. There was a couple magazines. They only appealed to very high niche wines, and we wanted to create something.
And they were pure, they were from media brands, and everyone and their brother now mixes commerce and content. It's whether you look at Patagonia or Red Bull, the New York Times, Gwyneth Paltrow, Noble Rot, which is a really awesome wine journal.
Well, you're right, John. We had a unique proposition.
We were 30 years ahead of that.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite. Today, people who are in the media business, there's a dearth of advertising. They said, how are we going to find another revenue stream? Let's sell stuff. And they're doing that. But Sybil and I, in the 80s, were selling stuff. And we said, how can we educate people about our products so they'll buy more of our accoutrement? So we decided to start a magazine. So in 88, we launched the Wine Enthusiast magazine, originally called Wine Times, but we changed that name. And it was more user-friendly. Our goal was not to make unwarranted assumptions about what people knew about wine. We always educated them. And so I said, how am I going to get attention with this magazine? I mean, there was another one out there, but it was a little elitist. And I said, okay, I got to get the best writers. So what did I do? I made a deal with the two of the most famous scribes, one of which was Hugh Johnson, the venerable British author who wrote the World Atlas of Wine and many, many, many books, universally respected, great author. And the second one, of course, was the very popular Robert Parker, who is the inventor of the 100-point scale with his newsletter, The Wine Advocate. So I created a deal with each of them, promoting their, either in Hugh Johnson's case, he had very high-end accessories with his brand. We sold them for him, and he did columns for us. And Bob Parker, we advertised his Wine Advocate on the order form of our catalog, and he consented to writing for us for a few columns. We had a few columns about. So then we could go out to the trade and say, hey, guess what, guys? we have the two greatest writers in winedom here. Why don't you try doing some media with us? And they did. And it became very successful.
And it was as much, talking about the way that just normal people drank, even though we had the credibility of the wine ratings and we, built that whole system later. Why is it so important to have the blind tasting system that we developed?
Very
How does
important. I
that
mean,
help
wine
the
is like
magazine?
art. It's esoteric. It's the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. One person's Jackson Pollock might be another person's Van Gogh. You never know which thing people will love. It's the same thing with wine. It's what you like and what's delicious. But people are a little insecure about wine. Hence, it's great to hear from an authority about what's good. So we identified that, and we started set up a tasting department to rate and review wines. This year, I believe, and I'm sure, John, we tasted as much as 25,000 wines all over the globe, and we are, I believe, the only people that taste totally blind. And right?
But it started very small again, and it must have just been nerve-wracking. I mean, you knew wine. You obviously knew, what was going on in the wine industry very well. But for the publishing media world, you were a novice. This was your first.
It's true. It's true. Actually, I met early on with another publisher who asked me a lot about my business, and we were actually an advertiser with them. And then next thing I knew, there was a competitive catalog. So I said, okay, I'm going to start a magazine. So that's what I did. And then in the early 90s, now we have to leave the 80s for a second, there was a bit of a recession, and that publisher exited the accoutrement business. But by then, I started to feel my oats. I was getting it. I understood how to be a publisher and enjoy it. And, the thing that differentiated it, they were putting ads in the catalog, and I was putting in my magazine, I was putting my own ads, which was both very ridiculous. So, it was, both of us were foolish. We didn't understand the businesses. They say you should never get in another guy's game, and it couldn't be more appropriate than that situation. But I persevered, and I can't say that the other guy did.
And now a word from our sponsor. I always get my favorite Italian red wine from Total Wine, but I wanted to mix things up and try something new. Arriving straight from Tuscany are the new St. Giorgio wines from the Castellani family. For 120 years, they've been dedicated to the craft of traditional Italian winemaking, producing top-quality wines for incredible value. I just tried the Vino Nobile with a rating of 96, and it did not disappoint. And with bottles starting at just $9.99, I can't wait to try more. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, always find what you love and love what you find at Total Wine & More. Drink responsibly. Be 21.
The first issue, do you remember how many printed and how you felt about them? And
the first issue of the magazine?
Yeah,
we lost our ass. It was terrible, because we didn't have ads. We had our own. We put our own product in there, which was ridiculous, of course. I don't remember what the print run was on the first issue, but I hope it was small, because I know whatever it wasn't a good idea to print so many, because, and also we used, which was the great synergy of our business, the controlled circulation of the people who bought the wine Eurokovs and wine refrigerators. Obviously, they're interested in wine and passionate about it. So we felt as if that was a great audience for our advertisers, of which we had very few in those days.
At what point did you feel that, this is working? And the magazine started to become what it is now.
It really got hot, I have to say. And, it's all about making friends. You have to meet people. And I started going out to California 5 times a year, which was a lot, I had a young family. And I met people. And of course, what could be more fabulous than the people in the wine industry? They're brilliant, sophisticated. They're the most culturally forward farmers, I guess, in the world. People who have other crops might disagree, but I kind of think growing grapes is a little more fun than beets or succotash, for example.
And looking back over 35 years, what's something that has happened either in the magazine or in the wine industry in general, that has just truly surprised you, that you didn't foresee coming in 1988?
Well, of course, the fighting varietals, of course. I mean, I'm glad it happened, and that was a big, big change. Tourism. Who would think that so many people would want to visit wineries? And, it's like a huge industry. We just did our most recent Wine Star Awards, which is an event. We're in the events business. I'm very proud of in San Francisco, and we identified that wine is a multi-billion-dollar contributor to the economy of California because of, obviously, who would have thought this? Tourism, all sorts of industries that wine reaches out either directly or indirectly, and hence the multi-billion-dollar impact. I guess that's one of the biggest trends and the importance of wine to the United States. I think the most important thing of all is that America became a wine-consuming nation, and people had their doubts about that. One of our early issues, we asked people in the trade, will America ever be a wine-consuming nation? All famous people all around. I should get you that issue. You should see it. It's early on one. And I would say at least half said never, never. And one person said, Bruno Prat, who is the venerable, was owner of a Côte d'Estournel in Bordeaux. He said, well, only if the first taste of wine is a great one. And I agree with that. People, and that's what's happened. People's first experience with wine now is a little different than when they first tasted Riuniti or Boone's Farm. They're tasting delicious wines, and the quality of wine, particularly, I have to say, in the United States and around the world, has risen dramatically. It's just a delicious beverage. I mean, it really is. Of course, I'm not 100% objective, but I really believe it's true.
And of course, parallel to that, well, first, what were people drinking before America was a wine drinking country? They were
Good
drinking
question.
beer?
Yes, beer, and they were drinking spirits. Whiskey. Of course, whiskey has its own revolution, but they were drinking Tom Collins and cocktails and highballs and things of that nature. I mean, I was surprised when I saw James Bond ordering, what was his wine? 64 Latour? I don't know. He ordered that. And he also ordered, I forgot what's the champagne? The Champagne House will be very mad at me for not remembering. But, no one ever on TV, you watch a TV show, people are drinking cocktails. No one ever, suddenly, people started drinking wine on TV. Now, forget about Bravo, every show, people have a glass of wine in their hands. Why? Because when you have a glass of wine in your hand, it elevates you as a person. It really says you're sophisticated, smart, and cultural. And that's a really wonderful thing about wine that I'm particularly proud of. And it's a healthful beverage as well. In 1992, the famous journalist who was one of the speakers on 60 Minutes, which is still around today, Morley Safer, spoke about the French paradox, which said, hey, why is it that the French don't have a high incidence of heart disease and people in the United States do? And it's because of resveratrol, this ingredient in red wine that helps keep your coronaries in good shape. So what happened after that is a pretty interesting story. The day after that, because 60 Minutes was so powerful and pervasive in those days, network TV isn't the same as it was then. Today, those days, it was really powerful. The sales of red wine grew 40%. I remember the Gallo Winery telling me they had a wine called Hardy Burgundy. They couldn't keep it on the shelves because consumers rushed to buy wine. They wanted, and that was a big revolutionary moment in time. The French paradox, which I think people should actually go to YouTube or something and watch. It's really cool.
So parallel to that change in the American drinking habits, Americans drinking wine, becoming a wine drinking nation, it also became very much a wine producing nation. We had Jim Gordon write about the 80s in Napa as Napa was becoming what we now know it. It wasn't that yet. It was still even Napa, a farming community.
Very nichey. And guess what? Today, all 50 states in the United States produce wine, including Hawaii and Alaska. And I was just at a wedding last weekend in Virginia, and guess where the wedding was held? At a winery. And the wines were delicious. So they make a phenomenal Viognier, sort of the signature grape of Virginia, and all the wines were great. And so the reason I'm bringing that to your attention is that wines from all over the United States are delicious, not only California, Oregon, Washington, New York State, and Virginia in that order, which is the largest producers of wine. There are some good wines in other states in the United States.
Yeah, no, it's funny when you look back at how people did talk about Napa, at least, in the 70s, it was orchards.
Yes.
It wasn't a sophisticated wine country. So now when we go to Michigan and, people are surprised that there's a beautiful estate in Michigan, it's like, yeah, that's how they talked about Napa 50 years ago.
Exactly. When I went to, I'll tell you a funny story. When I went to Napa for the first time in the 70s, they were so thrilled to see me. Come on in. I remember Joe Heights and his daughter Kathy Heights. I went to visit them, and there was no one there. And now you probably have to wait online, or you have to make an appointment, to get to see these some of these small wineries. But they welcome you consumers, tourists, with open arms, and happy to show you the great things they're doing.
Yeah, and now we have for many years do a California issue. Probably in 1986, that wouldn't have been a thought that a lot of
absolutely
people had.
not. It's a good point. But I now talk about California. It's not just Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino anymore. Paso Robles is creating amazing wines. Santa Barbara is creating amazing wines. Tilapia creating amazing wines.
Temecula.
So, well, you can have some Temecula wine with your tilapia, by the way, if you want. It's a good match.
So I didn't know we were going to talk about pairings today.
Yeah, well, that was a good pairing. Thanks for helping me out with my faux pas. Sorry, Temecula people.
And I don't know if many people know or not many people know that you're something of a singer.
Yeah. Well, it was so much fun. When I was in sales in the 70s after graduating the university, I used to talk to the retailers, and the way I sold them was I wrote a song about each of the new wines that I'm not going to sing them now, although I know you'd love me to. And I used the lyrics was sort of convincing them to purchase what I was going to buy, and I served them some ice cold wine. And she's sort of a forerunner of today. Every wine salesperson who goes into a retail or restaurant is bringing one of his wines to taste, but they weren't doing that in those days.
You were already bringing custom content to them.
I was bringing and cheese. We even had some cheese. And how could they say no? As a young guy singing a song, I sang. One day I was singing about a sangria. I wore a sombrero, which really. And then another time, I sang. There was a wine called Joseph Stubenliebchen Wein, and I wore a Tyrolia. Had Joseph Stubenliebchen Wein, drink ice cold with your Fräulein, and those were the sort of songs that we wrote. And it was fun. They always said yes, which who would say no to a young guy who's trying to make a living and singing his heart out?
No, looking back, just at the magazine that started in again just that very intense moment for wine in the late 80s. What are some of the things that you're most proud of that Wine Enthusiast has done over the years?
Well, first of all, with the catalog, I believe we had a major impact on growing consumption in the United States. Not only were we mailing millions of catalogs, we kept the word wine in people's forefront. It's very important to keep your product in front of people, and there weren't a lot of people doing it, although, as I mentioned, you had Riuniti and the Gammets spending a ton of money in the 80s. That was the drive. But Wine Enthusiasts also. We also helped provide wine enthusiasts with the gear that they needed to enjoy wine. Great glassware, great corkscrews, decanters, and we educated the consumer as to why with the catalog. Conversely, with the magazine, we really made wine fans out of people. We talked about various vineyards and why they were exceptional and told the stories. And, you couldn't do that in a catalog when you're wearing millions of catalogs. You had to really get right to the point and sell stuff because it was expensive. And so the synergies between commerce and media really sang. I love using that word, of course. And so we're particularly proud that we had a strong influence, I believe, Wine Enthusiasts did, on growing consumption in the United States with the millions and millions. In one year, we mailed 25 million catalogs, Right now, we have almost 200 employees. I'm kind of shocked because, as you may have mentioned, we started this business out of our attic, Sybil and I. It's grown to the point way beyond my wildest dreams, and I'm really proud of it. I'm proud of our great team. We have phenomenal people working for us, so that's all we are is our people, and that's true.
And you mentioned succession, but you must be very proud of.
Very proud of
your daughters are running
my
the show.
daughters. Erica Strum is running the commerce part of the business, and Jacqueline is running the media, the magazine part of the business. They're both presidents. They're supposed to be reporting to the CEO, me. For some reason, it's not happening as I expected as well. But those things happen. They want to take their own path, and I do sit back. Mostly, they probably won't agree with this, and allow them to do it. And they've done a marvelous job because, time marches on. And, what they're doing, because they're in their 30s, and Eric is just about to turn 40. I'm shocked that I have a daughter who's 40 years old. They get it. They're avant-garde. They're cutting edge. Everything they're doing is digital. And we're doing podcasts like this. We have phenomenal marketing, which a lot of our clients take advantage of, our massive email database, our social media department, and some of the many things that we do that only Eric and Jacqueline can describe. Someday they'll be interviewed by a colleague like you, John, I hope.
I hope that's soon.
For their success.
Wow, the 80s really was a revolutionary time for wine. Whether you were a wine drinker during that decade or you just started consuming it, Wine Enthusiast has been proud to be a part of your wine journey. Happy 35th anniversary, and here's to many more. If you liked today's episode, we'd love to read your reviews and hear what you think. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. You can also go to winemag.com/podcast for more episodes and transcripts. I'm JC Tops. Thanks for listening.